Guys, welcome to, I think it's the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour INCON version 4. And today we have as our guest the amazing polymath that is Richard Grossinger. Richard Grossinger and I have known each other for probably about 4 or 5 years. And he sent me his work called Dark Pool of Light, which is this incredible trilogy of books that's absolutely huge. And earlier on today, I was actually looking at these, and I thought, I wonder Richard's other works. And I started looking through, and I realized the amount of books he's written is just absolutely extraordinary, you know, and on such wide subjects and everything else that the mind boggles. And I'm just so delighted to have Richard as a guest today. What we're going to do is we're going to have the standard format of being completely impersonal, laid back, and everything else. Because every time Richard and I chat, and we've had a few conversations now, 2 hours go by, and we're still chatting about things and swapping ideas and learning about each other. And that's the exciting thing at the moment, as to how this friendship is developing, which is really wonderful. But what I'd like to do very quickly as well, and of course in the background we have Sarah James as well. Sarah, thank you as always for your support on this. And Sarah, in her inimitable way, will come in and make comments as time goes on. Sarah will also be monitoring what's taking place in the chat feed as well on Facebook, and should anything come through of interest, she'll let us know. But she'll also nip in with her own questions, because I'm sure she will have as many questions as the listeners and the watchers will as well. So Richard, very, very quickly, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Because your life story is absolutely extraordinary. So maybe for about just a little, yeah, absolutely. So could you just explain a little bit about who Richard Grossinger is and just how amazing your life has been?
I think all of our lives have been amazing. I mean, isn't a life itself amazing if you just take a step back and look at any life? You know, what context is it in? There's no context for it except the context it comes into and that it gives itself. But you know, I suppose for the purpose of this show, I grew up in New York City. I had a very confused, messed up family. I'm the only blood member of my natal family who didn't commit suicide. So there are a lot of dark marks there. And I actually began writing as a teenager, somewhat out of having been put in psychoanalysis as a child. I kind of magically converted it into a different narrative. Like, instead of speaking to the doctors, speaking to the angels and the guides. And then I discovered Jung in college, went to an Ivy League college in Massachusetts, and really, like you, a kind of typical English major for a while. And then in wanting to get out of that, I switched abruptly to anthropology for graduate school and went to the University of Michigan.
What facilitated that? Why anthropology of all subjects?
Well, I actually applied. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I just knew I'd had it with English criticism and so forth. And my girlfriend and I, we then got married, we started a journal together that was kind of metaphysical and anthropological and literary. And so I applied to different graduate schools and different things, and kind of came around to the idea that anthropology was the most general, so postponed any definitive choice for a while. And I had great dreams of learning Hopi and studying Hopi religion and stuff, and even spent part of a summer on the Hopi reservation. But I ran into politics in the department and my own youth and lack of sophistication, and I ended up, embarrassingly enough, doing a study of fishermen in Maine and New Brunswick, because that just fit in, and I could only get along with the ecological anthropologists there. I had grown up attempting to write fiction with people like Faulkner and Melville and Beckett as my models. But In college, I met the poet Robert Kelly, who was essentially a Hermetic poet and had a cult salon on the Hudson. And for a while, I tried poetry, but then I just began doing a form of experimental prose that was in a poetry tradition, in the Black Mountain literary tradition that he was loosely in. And when I went to graduate school in anthropology, I just pulled it over into kind of a sort of mythic prose. And for the next maybe 10 or 12 years, that's why there's such a long list of books, is because I wrote book after book, like a scroll in this. And various different publishers published little modules of it over a number of years, during which I did the field work. I taught college in Maine and then Vermont. I turned the journal, with my wife, I turned the journal into a publishing company that we named North Atlantic Books. And there are probably, I cannot even know how many at this point. There were about 12 or 14 or something literary books. I did readings at colleges from them during that era, an era that I think ended pretty abruptly in 1975. And I took a break from writing for a while, and when I went back to it, it was in the context of leaving college teaching, moving to Berkeley, California with two little kids and no job. Two little kids, one of whom is now a 51-year-old environmental biologist working on urban resilience under climate change in Berkeley. And the other is the mixed media performance artist, director, novelist, superstar, who took on the adult name Miranda July. But in 1977, they were just two tiny little kidlets being dragged out of a wonderful, Vermont lifestyle into this tight urban scene in Oakland, California, where I struggled. I had an advance from Doubleday to write the book that became Planet Medicine. And that was closer to what I wanted to do anthropology fieldwork on. And in the course of writing it, and I think it was a kind of sloppy, funky book, but it was a kind of emergence for me and for a lot of people who discovered the whole alternative medicine scene through it. And it also shifted the publishing company from a literary publishing company to an alternative medicine, and then martial arts and body work and the rest that came along. And it removed my then ambition, or I don't know if it was an ambition as much as a need to earn a living, to teach college again. I dropped it and became a publisher, and at the same time wrote books for other publishers that became centered around finally 4 topics: the original medicine, and then or history of medicine, alternative medicine. Then I did astronomy, which is closer to, well, they're all close to your territory, but I did that partly out of childhood involvement in science fiction and my teenage Mars scrapbook and stuff, and also just interest in astrology, in the solar system, in the origin of matter, the universe. And then I switched for a number of reasons. The next one I did was embryology, which is how we get a body. And I did 2 large embryology books that were much more unusual because other people were writing on healing or like astronomy, physics, but nobody was really writing directly on embryology, which seemed amazing because, I mean, the more I got involved in it, the stranger it seemed that you could get matter to just shape itself.
Do you know, that's one thing, again, that's always fascinated me, the idea of how that just happens. People take it for granted, don't they? They just say, oh, the embryo just develops and it develops in this way.
But immaculately. Yeah.
But it does it perfectly, doesn't it? It knows where it's going. It's almost teleological in its demand to get
right.
To
I have gotten more. I mean, that sort of has always been at the heart of my intellectual inquiry, the kind of mystery of the embryonic formation. And one of the lines that I came to, I forget which book, but I really liked, was the embryo is the universe writing itself on its own body.
Wow.
That was one of the epiphanies I came to. And then, while doing that, I got sidetracked. But I OD'd. I basically OD'd on all this information because I really have one foot in pop culture. And I went all the way back to the kind of kid who was a would-be novelist. And I rescued my high school writing. And I worked for a long time on these memoir books. One of them about growing up, what I called New Moon. One of them about my crazy family, which I called Out of Babylon. And then another one that I never published, but worked on over 45 years and just kind of finished the other day, more about the spiritual quest and relationships, called Episodes in Disguise of a Marriage. And those books took me not astray, but away from the topics. And I did that journey and wrote a bunch of books then that were more like the old experimental prose books like The Bardo of Waking Life and 2013. And then I came back to the consciousness topic with the trilogy that you showed, Dark Pool of Light. But I continued it, really the book, I mean, you probably have a copy. I have a copy here. The book that I'm supposedly talking about.
Yes.
This is really, I did this book with Inner Traditions, and it really is the kind of pulling together of all those threads. I mean, consciousness, embryology, cosmology, and to a lesser degree, healing in a much more concise format. And you and I connected originally, I don't even remember how, around the Dark Pool of Light. But where we really converge is in this newer book of mine. And at the same time, I built that publishing company up to the point where it was almost publishing 100 new titles a year. Did it for 17 of the years with my wife. Our kids grew up and went on their own lives. And eventually I bailed from that whole situation. We moved to Maine, where we are now, more full time. And in a story that's much too complicated to get into here, I left all that and took up at the invitation of Inner Traditions, my own imprint there called Sacred Planet Books, which then brought you and me back together because I began sort of seining for books out in the world. And I'd read your work back, I think it was more like 5 or 6 years ago when we first connected, but I came back to your work and sort of rediscovered it at a whole different frequency. And then we talked on the phone and, you read my book and you directed other authors to me and, here we are.
I mean, because one of the things that strikes me, and it's something that probably as writers is a fascinating topic to just explore, is the levels of inspiration, because you've described here all the areas you're interested in. But behind that is all the research and all the reading that you have to do. But what I would say about your writing style, and I've said this many times, both on Facebook and various other places, your writing works like poetry. Your book, I kept stopping and rereading the lines you were describing things, particularly the first 2 chapters of your new book, because they work in such your way with words. And the way you describe things is just simply incredible, and the power is in your words. As a poet, is that the style you tend to write? I mean, does it just come into, does it just download into you, the writing, or do you work on it? Do you hone it, or does it just come naturally?
Well, both. We had talked about this on the phone because we both have, in our own way, literary roots. It's not just that I started off trying to write literature or writing literature, however you want to take that, but from a belief that the deepest truths are unsayable. There's no language for them. So the closest that you will find is not in any texts or books of science or books of theory, maybe in philosophies, but that's a whole different issue. But you really find it, in Donne and Shakespeare and Melville and D.H. Lawrence and Annie Proulx and Richard Price and Blake. You get these hints of where the unknowable truth lies. So I think the way in which my work is unique, insofar as I've never seen anybody else who's doing this, is I'm writing the same kind of essentially inquiring prose into the interface between science, culture, and metaphysics. I'm writing right into that edge, just the same way any other kind of New Agey related science-oriented writer would, but I'm doing it completely as if I were like Coleridge or Melville or something. Not that I would lay claim to that, but that's the intention. That's always driving it. So the language is always open-ended and scanning at the same time, trying to pick up that sort of it's really, as you point out, it's like an almost channeled voice, the literary voice. It comes in that way. Who is it? Ken Jordan, the guy who started Reality Sandwich, told me once, you're writing on occult topics in a fine literary voice, which assures you of no audience at all. Better shut off Outlook so it doesn't keep beeping.
That's right. It makes it natural. It makes it real. I mean, one of the things, again, I was in New England many years ago, and I spent a lot of time in the Concord area. I was doing a business contract in Beverly, in Massachusetts, and you can actually feel the tradition, the kind of the Unitarian tradition of the towns around there. The great writers that came from a very small area. And there seems to be something uniquely New England.
Well, but the Lake Country in England, you feel the same thing.
Yeah.
You walk. I haven't traveled that much abroad, but boy, walking over those hills in the Lake Country, words were intimations of immortality, and Keats's Nightingale and all that. They come rushing back.
They do, and I totally agree. I mean, effectively, one of the poems, A Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey, the opening section of that, is just in the light of setting suns, is just electric, the way he describes that, as he does in the prelude. And effectively, when I was younger and we were doing, in A-level English, we were doing Wordsworth, I never appreciated the subtlety of his writing because, of course, as a teenager, you don't get the craving of trying to understand the reality behind this reality, beyond the facade. And this is what you do with your writing. You seem to, because that opening section is very much one of the most effective, attacks is the wrong word, dismantling of the materialist reductionist model of science I think I've ever read.
Yeah, and that is certainly I think that struck me for a long, long time. The kind of, I can remember, this crosses my mind just as it's an odd thing to throw in, but my brother, who was pretty mad and kind of a street person for much of his life, I remember at the time of the moon landing, which so excited me. I mean, I wrote about it, and I was much more wide-eyed and idealistic than him. But he really was, I mean, he was the materialism of the modern world absolutely tore him apart. He constantly referred to the invasion of the body snatchers. But I remember at the time of the moon landing, and God, after, you know, so many years after he said it, and also many years after his death, it keeps coming back to me. He said they didn't go to the moon, they went to some toilet bowl in hell. It's, you know, like, what does that mean exactly? But you know what I don't want to lose? There are different threads that come up, as always, as we talk. And the thing I don't want to lose is there, since we've been back in touch and I've kind of thrown myself into your writing, the two or three things that really changed my own worldview that have come out of reading you are, number one, I don't know anybody who's gone more deeply into where quantum physics meets existential reality or phenomenology, existential reality and phenomenology and epistemology, and all of them. Certainly, I've been part of the huge cadre that has followed quantum physics, you know, followed the thread and so forth. But you don't give up. You keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, and then you push it over that edge to where it actually becomes experience, and you make it possible for a person to think uncertainty, to think going in two directions at once. You know, you really put the reader through the double slit, and they come out on both sides, and that's a result of your own persistence with it, resulting in being able to finally say, as I don't know anybody else who has, that quantum physics does, in fact, describe the universe we experience better than Newtonian physics does. It's actually more real to our truth. And it opens us up to the big picture, which we can't see. Not just the big picture in particles, but the big picture in our own mystical sense of our own being.
Well, I always feel that quantum physics, there's something instinctive about quantum physics that reminds me in many ways of mysticism. And of course, you know, so many of the quantum physicists themselves, as they became older, you know,
so many of them and so many Tao of physics people have had that insight. But you alone, to my reading, have put it on an experiential basis, and then the other thing that you did that really seems unique, and God knows I haven't been through the bulk of your stuff, but is that you have taken our relationship to time and made palpable the fact that we exist inside time only as biological entities, but outside of our biological existence, there is no time. You know, one of my favorite people, the astrologer Elias Lonsdale, who I've known since the mid-70s, told me he's very good at picking up. He's a psychic astrologer, and he picks up things from outside. I remember maybe 4 or 5 years ago him telling me that he made contact with somebody who had crossed, and I forget what date it was, but he said at their moment of meeting, he said, "My God, I see you, Elias. I see you on October 17th, 2015 or whenever it was. I see you on that date." And you really recreate from within that wonderful sense of, here I am in time, with time moving, and really psychological and emotional time is moving at all different speeds within us, and we're already relativizing time. like in so many country and Western songs, time is, what time has stood still, or time heals a broken heart, or this or that. Well, but you capture that quality of into and outside of time, and of time going backwards and forwards, and of time travel. So those are the two things that stand out to me about your work so far.
Thank you. One of the things that you reminded me of then about the country and western song, I don't know if you know, there's a country and western song of what do you get if you play a country and western song backwards? And, you get your wife back, you get your car back, you get your life back. And it's perfect, isn't it? The kind of the idea of time going backwards and forwards and everything else as well. And of course, one of the things there that you were saying, and there's two things I'm working on. I mean, earlier on today, I'm trying to write an explanation of the Schrödinger wave function equation for the layperson. And that's really interesting. But what you find is that whenever you have to do this, in order to do that, you have to go back then to Prince Louis de Broglie and his matter waves. And then from the matter waves, you have to go back to Born and various other people. And you can never really get to the bottom of it. It's almost like one of those Russian dolls. You try to explain something. And something I came across recently, which I don't know if you've come across, is the Unhuru effect, whereby subatomic particles come into existence as you accelerate through space. So if you are moving in space, there are subatomic particles there. But if you're stationary, and of course, how do we continue what stationary is in space? I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because speed is relative to everything else. But these subatomic particles seem to come out of nowhere. And it's one of the points you make in your book, that the whole edifice of modern science is created upon that everything came from nothing 13.8 billion years ago and has progressed since then. Where does everything come from? Where do these particles flit in and out from? And your points there were incredibly powerful. That there's a leap of faith taking place, isn't there, in exactly the same way that the medieval schoolmen did.
Right. I feel that one makes the same journey many times, and other people make the journey too many times, and altogether you approach the sort of the hidden treasure in the center from all different angles. And one of the differences between, say, my earlier work and then Dark Pool of Light, and then Dark Pool of Light and the big jump to bottoming out the universe, is that I began in 2008. I began studying at the Berkeley Psychic Institute when I was still in Berkeley, and that was for me my first. I'd studied other things, but I had stayed away from psychic stuff. I think partly from superstition, somewhat from fear, and somewhat as a snob, and I was completely astonished by what just one could pick up in a few classes there. And then when I found out it was kind of a cult, and I didn't want to, and I wasn't going to sign their spiritual agreement, which was something like you might have been handed by, I don't know, by Jehovah's Witnesses or something. Mm-hmm. I switched. My old martial arts teacher had studied there, and then he had moved back to Minneapolis and was studying with this Midwestern psychic, John Friedlander, who was one of the early Berkeley Psychic Institute people. But then he later went to Harvard Law School, became a lawyer, and around the same time also sat with Jane Roberts while she channeled the later Seth.
Ah, so it's that Friedlander. I see. Okay, so he's kind of carried the Seth thing forward.
Yeah, right. So I got this Sethian perspective at the same time. So when I came back to these topics after all that, John had kind of bridged. He had used temporarily as a bridge the theosophical 7 planes of consciousness, and used them very creatively. They come from Hinduism through Blavatsky and so forth and get flipped around entirely. As John said, one of the amazing things is that Blavatsky took the Hindu system and by not understanding it, made a whole different system out of it, which in many ways reached far beyond it. But then because she was a Victorian, could not really use it because she was restrained by her Victorian impulses. But John then comes back to that system through Seth and just wildly expands it. That's a lot what I do in Bottoming Out the Universe, is I follow that thread from the standpoint that I wish I could, as we distract ourselves endlessly by, I haven't looked at my own book for quite a while too, so that's a problem. But so I don't know if I'll oh yeah, I did find what I wanted to find. So this idea that it really comes across through the seven planes because consciousness, in a sense, intelligence turns into matters. It moves down through the planes, and our reality is kind of originating on the around the monadic and atmic planes, and it then gets converted into a common into a collective image, like a consensus reality on the Buddhic plane, which we have to dream, like the Australian dream time, the Aboriginal dream time. And then it comes through the causal plane, the soul, into the into etheric and then physical reality. And the more I kind of thought in those terms and visualized in those terms, the more the daily world softened in my eyes and became like I could see that it was originating, that it's kind of emanating out of my own participation, but not just me. Every squirrel and every bird and every tree is also contributing through the, if you use that metaphor, through the Atmic, Buddhic, causal planes. They're all pouring into this reality, and that's the degree of complexity that we're looking at. And one of the projects I have had to go back to as an editor this time, because I brought it into Inner Traditions, is a book I made of 15 years of John's classes. This took me hundreds of hours to do, to excerpt just the pieces that where John and his channeling, because he channels either Seth or a Seth-like entity there, where he really hits on this. And this one passage I quoted, which I got out of a talk, is, I don't know, it's one of the epitomes for me of hitting it. I love this thing out of his class. He says, everyone on this planet creates reality according to their beliefs. Oh, how he got into this is he asked his guide, he was arguing with a guide, and the guide said, even if everyone were like you, there wouldn't be peace on earth. And he was like, what? If everyone were like me, there wouldn't be peace on earth? And he goes, what if everyone were like the Dalai Lama? Would there be peace on earth? And the guide says, no, because, and then he goes on to say, everyone on this planet creates reality according to their beliefs. So if the Dalai Lama is on this planet, and he is, then he plays some part in the movement to world peace. But there are aspects in his aura that match vibrationally, not in the normal English sense of the word match, but in the psychic sense, that get lit up in the same way as terrorists, because there couldn't be terrorists if he didn't have some match. Now think about this, that we're all matching this across the spectrum. We're matching Donald Trump too, or Donald Trump couldn't exist. But there's energy, we're all matching each other's energy, and that's what's creating, we're all we're vibrating at the same frequency. And also every little insect and flower is also vibrating at that frequency. And then he says, it's not like if all of a sudden he, meaning the Dalai Lama, cleared that match, all terrorists would disappear from the earth. He would disappear from this probability. And well, that's one little glimpse, of it. Like and you certainly play with probability. I mean, you take it much further in some ways than I do, or even than John does. You're like almost a probability fundamentalist. But I mean, somewhere in the delicacy of those propositions, those quanta, lies this amazing reality we've invented. Because I think the only possible explanation is that we're inventing it. Nothing else makes sense really as an ontology for this. That it's something coming out of us in that sense. And just to kind of keep the connection and kind of try and volley back to you a bit here, the way in which I feel a divergence from you is we go like up to that point together, and then where I go, and I frustrate a lot of people like this, I go off into, I don't know, I don't have a clue. I just am amazed, and then I sort of head into pop culture a lot because, it's sort of like, well, it's just like, well, this is what we're doing, and I go off there. You, on the other hand, really go towards being a scientist, and you want to like really nail that thread. And I'm sort of like, why, Tony? You're not ever going to do it. You're not ever going to nail it. You're not ever going to say the definitive thing or solve it. So why not kind of not so much give up as yield as like in a Tai Chi sense, just yield to it and see where it moves you.
That has been said to me so many times. Why have I got this driving need to understand rather than instinctively sense in many ways? Mm-hmm. And I think it's because just the way my brain works. My brain works by wanting to take things apart I guess I'm an ultimate materialist reductionist in that argument. I want to take things apart to understand what makes them work. And I feel that that's my route to understanding. But there are so many times in my search where suddenly I have that sensation of the noetic, that sensation that it's far vaster than I can ever understand or my mind can ever understand. And I need to go into that concept of no thing, that kind of at-one-ment.
Well, you take it apart, even after you say it's a ghost, you take it apart. So you're taking apart a ghost. And
and I think your analogy there, one of the models I'm working on, and if you get the opportunity, my latest book, I very much discuss, as you know, the concept of the egregorial and the concept that we are collectively creating external reality. Our perceptual universe is created by us by the act of the collapse of the wave function of observation and the way in which statistically a point particle can be anywhere. And effectively we observe it or measure it, and it's in a point place, which means we're reducing our reality down to our worldview, and you're reducing your reality down to your worldview, and we all overlap. Now, if we then go further and think that, the concept of Atman and the concept of the idea of a singular consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, it means effectively we're all part of this greater something that are all collectively observing. I mean, there's the Roland Knox poem that it always affected me, the idea where the poem says something along the lines of what happens to the tree in the quad if there's nobody looking at it. And it's like a little note. And then underneath it says, the tree always continues to appear in the quad because I'm always in the quad. Yours sincerely, God. So the idea, like Berkeley said, that the ultimate observer is God, who's observing everything at all times to keep it into reality. Now, for me, that there's truths in there. And if you look into the traditions of Eastern traditions, you find that it comes up time and time again. The idea of that's Maya out there, it's not real, it's Maya, and we exist within it. But my question would be, coming back to that, is the concept of egregores such as Seth and whatever is also being channeled subsequently is something that also intrigues me as to what exactly is Seth? Because of all of the channeled entities, as many of my readers will know, I have a real problem with people channeling things. I think there's an awful lot of shysters out there who are just manipulating people. But Seth is the one I keep coming back to, going, there's more to this. And people keep telling me, somebody recently, well, about 4 years ago, sent me a book. Neil Geddes Ward, thank you for that, Neil, if you're listening. Neil Geddes Ward sent me a book on Seth and David Bohm, and the way in which an awful lot of what Seth says is very much what David Bohm was arguing. So there are the mystical scientists that are moving into this field, and we need to draw them in many ways. But what's your opinion on Seth? What do you think Seth really is? And before we finish, that there'll be other people listening in here. I mean, Sam Treasure is going to be listening in, and Mariam Abadi will be listening in. And the three of us are working on trying to pull together an experiment regarding the true nature of egregores, like Seth. So what would be your opinion of what Seth is to you? Or what do you think Jane Roberts was channeling? Was it part of herself? Was it her daemon? Or what was it?
Yeah. In that book, Bottoming Out the Universe, I have a chapter that was for a long time just titled "Who is Seth?" And at the very end, they wanted it. They thought it was like a bad chapter title, so it got changed to the Superconscious Source. I almost like "Who is Seth" better. It's just more offhand. I take it directly out of the writings, and also out of John Friedlander's writings on it. Seth is simultaneously a future form of Jane Roberts. But when Jane Roberts gets to that future form, it won't be Seth. So
because the question I meant to ask you is, in that, Seth calls Jane Roberts a completely different name and calls her as if she's male, which I thought was quite intriguing.
Right, which is her, in going for the sum of all her incarnations, he picks the name Rupert that best defines her in the sum of her incarnations.
Oh, right. Okay.
Likewise, Seth is a transmission made up, according to some sources, of 10,000 or more entities that have not only finished their lifetime, but a lifetime cycle. And only one of them is Seth. And that Seth was the most convenient tag for that entity to kind of reach into the world. And that with Jane Roberts, that larger entity, collective entity, John uses the term multi-personhood, that larger multi-personhood reaches into the world and becomes Seth to Jane Roberts. But at the same time, it's coming out of Jane Roberts because it's in her. He can only come through her. And that's why John refuses to, in this book of his, which will be out late next year, we've at least for now subtitled Recentering Seth, which I wasn't sure John would allow, because he basically says it just irritates the Seth people when anybody else claims to channel Seth. Mm-hmm. And partly because Seth said, I will only come through Jane Roberts in her lifetime. But John says, Seth, that not Seth by name, but that source has been all through society on all different levels. He thinks that Alice Bailey channeled it as the Tibetan, and that John is channeling it as Mataji. So I think just using the name Seth is convenient because it also brackets the bunch of material that Jane Roberts developed, which has a lot to do with who she was. So it certainly has large elements that are her, and then large elements that are Seth or this other thing. But then where is there ultimately a meaningful distinction between the two? But they fuse in that form. Then you have other people. I mean, there's a whole group in California that's channeling everybody. I mean, I like these people, so I don't mean to be make a joke at their behalf. But on the other hand, honest to God, Kobe Bryant just died, and he's already delivering a philosophy.
Well, doesn't that make you suspicious that
yeah,
so much of this is being manipulated by snake oil salesmen to earn money? You know,
I wouldn't be that cynical. I go with John Friedlander in this. They're channeling thought forms. They're not channeling beings.
But this is then interesting. But then this is then interesting, isn't it? Because if we can, have you read The Hungry Ghosts, Joe Fisher at all, or you're aware of? Right, Joe Fisher was an English guy that was living in Toronto, and one of his a medium he went to started channeling individuals who were that had relationships in some way with him, and one of them was a young Greek girl that she claimed that Joe and her had been together in the 17th century in Greece, and she named a village and everything else as well. And Joe goes over to Greece to find that none of it was true, and then he came to the conclusion that what these are, and it was something I was discussing with Paulino yesterday in another podcast, is that these entities seem to be, they manifest and they're real. They come into our world and they will say whatever is needed in order to ingratiate themselves with us in some subtle way. Because I would always love just two things I'd like to do. I'd like one of these entities to acknowledge another entity, for Seth to acknowledge that Jay-Z Knight. She channels this 5,000-year-old Atlantean warrior.
Oh, Ramtha.
Now, if Seth had turned around and said, "Yeah, I met Ramtha once, and yeah, we discussed this."
They never
do, do they? They never do.
This is the scientist in you.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's me. It's me applying Occam's razor to it and saying, the simplest solution is.
Well, that doesn't seem like a good solution to me, because neither of these people exist in the form that they're manifesting to human beings in, nor are these human beings manifesting them on the same frequency. So how could they possibly meet? They're strangers in the night at the extreme.
But if they are aware of what is inside the mind of the person that is channeling them, I cannot believe that Jay-Z Knight doesn't know about Seth. I cannot believe in a million years that Jay-Z Knight...
She may not know about, just to, keep it as this thought experiment, she may not, if she knows about it, she may not know about it by that name, or it may take a completely different shape in her mind.
It could do. So in which case, what I would always like is one of these channeled entities to actually tell us something that we don't know yet, but we will know soon. Something that would be absolute proof, and turn around and say, you will discover on Mars a particular element that will revolutionize the world. Or even something simpler than that, something mathematical that they could say they're aware of, but they never do that. What we get is new age stuff.
Well, there's so many different ways to go with that. But the thing that strikes me that seems the most significant is that the mystery is what's driving the manifestation. So the idea that you're going to get an answer to the mystery is that would just stop the manifestation. If you got the manifestation would fall apart, and we'd fall right through it into something else. Somewhere in that book, in that long written unpublished book Episodes, I have the comment. I don't even remember exactly how I said it, but it was about how this unsolved mystery is what's driving. It's what's driving every act, and it's not just driving every act for us. It's driving every act for the bluebird or for the worm, even. And at the moments, at each mortal moment, and especially at moments of crisis, that's the only thing that gets that creature through to the next moment. And if you take that away, and not that it's possible to take it away, not in this manifestation. I think it's a much too exquisitely complex manifestation to find a key to it. But if you took that away, you would actually stop the motion of each of these creatures, and you would impede their ability to act with urgency and full beingness in that moment. And so I think ultimately it's kind of like a fallacy. It's a little bit like the same fallacy as saying, if the Dalai Lama could stop matching the terrorist vibration, then there would be peace on earth. He can't, because as John said, if he stopped matching their vibration, he'd disappear from this probability. And I think if you solve the probability, then it's no longer a probability.
Yeah, no, that is true. And one of the things that, of course, there's the other alternative argument that this could be very much aspects of dissociative personality syndrome. But then, you then give it that label, but effectively you still have to come down with the fact that when somebody has a dissociative personality syndrome, or they are still manifesting alters, they're still manifesting other consciousnesses that are radically different to them, and I have read that, they're under certain circumstances that that either the DNA changes or there is something radically different when the different manifestations come in, when people change.
Yeah, are you just talking about multiple personality?
Yeah, but it's the more politically correct term is dissociative personality syndrome, but it's actually multiple personality syndrome.
That is somebody who has, because I've gone through a huge kind of rabbit hole in the last couple of years, and I've experienced enormous dissociation without any multiple personality sense. And when I think about all of it, I also think about how my daughter will often say, "Don't pathologize it," because she likes to dance along a very far edge, and her son is gender fluid and all that, and there's a tendency to sometimes say something that implies like a symptomatic element, and that's part of her own belief set, is that the moment you pathologize something, you lose it.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
So I was having such trouble dealing with my own crisis. It was so overwhelming and so seemed so beyond me that I went back to Berkeley for a year. We went out there and rented a place for a year after totally leaving there 5 years earlier. And I didn't know who I was going to work with, but I ended up working with somebody who I'd known for a long time but never known well, a psychologist named Matt McKay, who also was a founder of a publishing company, a very good one called New Harbinger. And,
yes, I know it.
And Matt he's an amazing person. He's run all these clinics. He ran an early clinic in Haight-Ashbury, and he's now running a PTSD clinic for vets mainly. And I ended up working with him in that clinic. And, we did lots of things. And when we started, we did EMDR, we did like some hypnotic regression. But when we started off, he said he was convinced that, and that's why the word so struck me. He said he's convinced I was experiencing severe dissociation. I was back in a place I'd lived for almost 40 years, and I wasn't recognizing it as the place of my own experience. It was looking like a past life. Wow. And I kept using the phrase, I feel like a walk-in in my own body.
How intriguing. Okay.
And Matt said the first few sessions we did, he was convinced I had a pretty acute pathology. And by the fourth session, and doing a couple of hypnotic regressions that were, whether they were past life or not, they were certainly weird. Mm-hmm. They were strange, and they brought together very profound threads. But he said he changed to the fact that it was actually a spiritual crisis. And they're sort of indistinguishable, sort of the way Jane Roberts and Seth become indistinguishable. I think that a spiritual crisis will throw all out pathological symptoms too. Partly because of the culture we're in. There's no sanctuary for these crises. In fact, there's no sanctuary for anything. And here we are in the middle of a pandemic, which is just showing how spiritually shallow the whole society is, because it's providing such a thin, a thin layer for anybody, and especially those on the front lines of this. It's heartbreaking to watch how kind of badly, I mean, well, yes, too, but how badly a certain swath of the civilization is doing with this.
Well, it's intriguing. When we were discussing this, weren't we, a few days ago, and the idea here, I'm reminded of people like Martin Heidegger and the concept of design and the concept of being thrust into life. But we are our own narrative, aren't we? We perceive ourselves from our own history, what we've done in the past and what we anticipate to do in the future. But when we start looking into ourselves, and I'm reminded there of, I can't remember the guy that wrote the book on not having a head. Was it Harding or Hardy? I think it was Harding, I think. He was walking one day in the hills and he suddenly looked down at his body and said, I've never realized for all my life, the one thing I haven't got is a head. And of course, it's true. If you look down at your body, the one thing you cannot see is your head. And it caused a great feeling of disassociation in him. And it again is a fascinating idea. And you saying, suddenly like being a drop-in in your own world, and I know there's the psychological concept. I think it's jamais vu, where effectively everything suddenly looks strange. Whereas we're used to looking at the things the same. But that can happen. And suddenly, we lose our grip on exactly what we are because we don't know. You look inside, you don't find anything, do you? The inside of us, you go deep in, and what do you find? That it starts to get a little bit strange. And of course, then you start to think, well, am I just reactions of chemicals within my brain? Is it just a reaction of neurons?
I don't think you have to go that far, but I do think about the bubbles that people will say, Trump is the perfect example of somebody who's put himself in a bubble, and the bubble seems so real that he actually can do all this, fulminating and everything in the bubble without being aware of it. But then I think that most people are in bubbles of one size or another. And when the bubble breaks, and that's sort of what I feel happened for me. It's a moment of tremendous opportunity, but it's not pleasant because the bubble is our comfort zone. My friend Elias, who I mentioned earlier, the astrologer, said to me at the time, well, you don't get to go from one comfort zone to another. And I realized, well, that's what we really want to do. If we're going to have revelations, what we want to know is what's the first class way, like the comfort coach, or comfort first class line, so that we can have revelations and also be comfortable. And I think the very nature of revelation is that it's not comfortable and that you have to actually take the journey in order to get there. That this psychic I've worked with and did a book with called Jump Girl in Vermont, Sally Crow, said to me a little over 2 years ago, she read where I was and she said, you better pray a bit because there's no way around this, only through it. And I sort of got what she meant, and I did. In other ways, I didn't have really full appreciation for that. And in the last 2 years, among other things, I have deeply lived the suicides of all three of my family members, my mother, brother, and sister, not in a narrative sense, because I've written about them in a narrative sense, but I've internally kind of died with them. I don't know quite how to describe it. It's like I had to do each of them each as it came up in its own time, in order to actually not just grieve them, which is hard enough, but to get myself past that moment, in myself that was frozen there by that. And that just seems like, well, I mean, we'll go anywhere, but I don't know. Are we timed at an hour?
No, it's all right. We're not timed at now. We can go as long as we like. Okay. What I'd probably like to do at the moment is to bring Sarah in on this and involve her more. Sarah, have you got any thoughts, feelings, observations, or are there any questions coming through from the people listening in?
There are quite a few questions. I just really loved that. Everything you said, Richard, I really feel a great relationship with lots of the stuff that you say about there. And it makes me think a lot of Steiner. I really enjoyed reading Steiner's knowledge of the higher worlds. And he talks about the 7 planes of existence. And I had a similar experience reading Steiner and feeling that I began to perceive my reality differently as a result of that. And I think I felt less that I was seeing things trickle into a reality and more like my reality fine-tuned to a particular level. And one of the other things that I thought about when you were talking about studying embryology was Alan Turing and his study of morphogenesis being one of the last things that he was researching before he died. And I kind of think that we missed a real opportunity there, because I think that would have been one of the most amazing things that he did. And what else was I thinking about? I was thinking about what you were talking about with regard to disassociation. And I always think about this when it comes to actors. I think actually the personality is a huge illusion. And if you spend any time where you're not having to actively engage your personality, you fragment very quickly. I had an experience happen to me like that when I did a silent meditation retreat, just not talking and just not seeing anyone. I suddenly was just nothing and no one. And I think that those kind of situations are obviously things that you grow out of, but they're very uncomfortable at the time, even if you do it in a very safe environment like a meditation retreat.
Yeah, because the you're not a safe environment. The retreat may be.
Yeah.
You're not.
Yeah, there's probably like less safe places to do it than a meditation retreat, but but it was probably the most valuable thing I've ever done for myself, just experiencing that. And I think that at times of crisis, people go through that similar breakdown, and people often say that dissociative identity disorder arises out of an extreme childhood trauma in many cases. So in order to cope with it, you have to split off your personalities. But I do wonder about acting and how that affects people, because I think if you spend long enough in a role, you realize how flexible personality and sense of self can be.
Yeah, I've noticed that as part of the Inner Traditions editorial team now, that a book not through me, but the actor Peter Coyote has written a book that they're going to be publishing about, and he's also a Zen master. So it talks about the masks as part of a Zen process. In the book. I forget the title. It's not out yet. It's a year away, but the title is something about Tano and the Lone Ranger, but I can't remember how it exactly goes.
You read some of these questions out from our audience.
Yeah, please.
So Theo asks, what are your thoughts on evidence of very ancient advanced human societies with, for instance, extraordinary stonemasonry abilities? Also other evidence in books like Forbidden Archaeology, The Hidden History of the Human Race by Cremo and Thompson.
Before you hit the word, I was going to say, oh, here comes the forbidden archaeology question. Like everyone else, I think about it. I'm just attracted to, at this moment, because it's recent, to mentioning the new movie about UFOs, The Phenomenon, because that so opens up the. I mean, it kind of grounds the UFO issue in something very palpable. I don't have any particularly great unique insight into that stuff. I'm as intrigued as anybody by it, and I'm also both gullible and very open-minded, because I did do graduate anthropology and have friends who are archaeologists. I do get their laughter about that and their disbelief that I would even entertain it for a moment. And I don't know whether that's because I'm being tricked, like by Piltdown Man or something, like some sort of forgery. But I find it really interesting, like those giants in Peru or so forth. I don't see how that could be faked. And like the seemingly like computer parts brought up from the ocean, covered in like, it doesn't seem to me that it's a hoax. And it more just falls into the category of a great mystery.
I think I'd like to jump in there as well, because it's something that both Sarah and I are interested in, is the Antikythera device. And funnily enough, next year, if the lockdown ceases, Kythera is one of the Greek islands I'm going to be trying to go to, because, of course, I've known about that particular thing for many, many years, and it's always intrigued me because it was a device that was found on correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, but a Greek shipwreck of some description off Antikythera between Crete and the Peloponnese. And it clearly is some kind of very, very complex device. And I think it is incredibly arrogant of us to assume that we are the epitome of modern civilization, and it clearly isn't. And I think, Richard, in one of your books, don't you make this point? I think it's in your book, it might be in one of the others I've been reading recently, that all societies always consider themselves to be the epitome of scientific advancement.
I do write about that in Bottoming Out the Universe, that in discussing the materialism of science, that you get these scientists who feel that they've made the theory of everything. And it just seems to me sort of laughable on this. I mean, if you just take the astronomical universe, however you want to take it, this one little tiny planet off in this one little tiny galaxy, and they've solved it all. They have the answer. And yet, I mean, that's like the classic Stephen Hawking, fantasy that he's got. He put it all together and nailed it. And I think that that's generally because they leave consciousness out.
Excellent point. An excellent point. Yes, they do. The Chalmers hard problem.
I think that I do believe there are a lot of hoaxes, and that a lot of people really want to believe things and will follow that narrative. Like you look at people that believe in the flat earth or claim to believe in a flat earth. And I know that there are photographs that have been manipulated, and they'll get shared and people aren't necessarily interested in finding out the truth, because it's more exciting to believe in aliens and all this kind of stuff. And I think the Antikythera mechanism, people do actually know how that works now and what it is, and they've reconstructed one and they've made it work. And it's an astronomical device for working out and timing festivals according to celestial movements. And there were similar things made around that time. And it fits in with stuff that was going on culturally around that time as well. So there's lots of misinformation out there, because have you seen Gaia TV at all? Like Gaia TV has lots of these TV shows where it's people presenting information as if this is the amount and the sum total of everything we understand about it. But I've never really understood people peddling the ancient alien theory if they can't read hieroglyphs themselves, and claiming that archaeologists can't read hieroglyphs or Egyptologists can't read hieroglyphs, because they clearly can, and there's a consensus with what that language means.
That's a very good point.
Well, do you think that because some crop circles were clearly hoaxed and the hoaxers admitted it? Does that mean that all the crop circles were hoax? Because that's, of course, what happened is once Doug and Dave said we made some.
There's an interesting point there. I did an event at the Glastonbury Symposium a few years ago, and I stayed in a hotel that I'd been put up by the people who had arranged it. It was a Crop Circles conference, and for some bizarre reason they invited me to speak, which was really enjoyable, and I really quite enjoyed it. But of course, my angle was slightly different to the rest of the speakers. But it was fascinating when the next morning over breakfast, the lady who was the landlady, and she was talking about the conference, and she said, of course, everybody around here knows that they're all faked. And she turned around and she said, because we know, because we put the people up that do it. They come over from Italy. And literally, there are groups of people that come over from Italy and they create the crop circles. And in many ways, they work with the farmers because the farmers know they're going to do it and everything else. Because my question with crop circles is always, why would you travel the vast distance of space to knock down some pieces of grass in a field in Dorset or wherever, and put a really bizarre message on them when you could land on the White House lawn and communicate straight away? Now, I know that there was something in medieval times and everything called the mowing devil, and where they did have crop circles. And crop circles just seem to be...
Well, I don't think that anybody's coming any distance. I think that it's I'm just speaking off the top of my head, but I have written a lot about this, and I think of them as a kind of energy that we don't know, a kind of maybe superpositional energy, faster than light energy, and that it can be broadcast very far away and instantaneously be present, because that's what it looks like when they're formed. It doesn't look like anybody's come down and made them. The movies of the very few movies of their formation, and most show like a tiny ball of light and a spontaneous movement. If that's a terrestrial technology, it's not one that we know anything about. And in the movie, The Phenomenon, Jacques Vallée, who I know passingly and did a couple of books with in the past, takes metals recovered from the debris to a lab at Stanford, where they're analyzed with very new equipment. I don't exactly know what it does, but if I remember right, the point was that these metals that the UFOs were made out of, the little debris they got from them, have not been made on Earth because they've been made by rearranging particles within the atoms of the metal.
That's a very interesting one, because one of the future guests I'm hoping to get on this show will be a guy called Pierre Rubessa. And Pierre Rubessa is a fascinating guy, absolutely fascinating. I met him when I visited Switzerland a few years ago, and we've met a couple of times socially since. And Pierre has in his possession something he calls the octagon, I think, or the octave device. And he's had this tested. It was given to him by an entity. Now, Pierre is a fascinating guy because he earns his living as an inventor. He's a modern day Tesla. And he channels all this information. He writes it in books. And then suddenly the entity that's been in his life all the time, which I would argue is his daemon, will tell him, go to this book now and take it out the cupboard, read it, because you'll understand it. And he does it. And he has inventions and he makes lots of money out of them. He's only recently got his first patent in America. So he's that good. But he showed me this little device. This little coin thing he was given. And he was telling me that they've had this tested, and it's no known physical. It's not of this earth, and it's the only thing that can describe it as a form of plasma. So clearly, there are things here. And again, could it be the way we're collectively creating our reality by our anticipations?
I do wonder about that element of it, and I wonder whether all these things can occur simultaneously. The scientist will see the reductionist model, the spiritualist will see a spirit side of things, and someone who's perhaps a psychologist will see an emotional picture. But it does seem to be that it's like if you stop looking at it, it stops happening, and you have to kind of choose which narrative you're going to take, and then you know, when you do watch something like Ancient Aliens or Gaia TV, I'm sure there are some of those people that really fully believe the story that they're telling, and therefore everything does seem to fall in place for them, and that's the reality that they see. And then other scientists look and break stuff down. You know, it's as if you take a living flower and take all of its components apart. It's no longer the living entity. You have to kind of think something into existence. You have to suspend your disbelief, like watching a movie, in a way, to like fully engage in that reality.
Well, this is very Richard. There was a very interesting point I just need to put in though, because it links in quite well to your work. Because of course there is the famed Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in anthropology, the way in which language creates the model of how we understand the world. And as I remember, was it Benjamin Lee Whorf that worked with Hopi Indians? You know,
the punctual and segmentative aspects of verbs.
Yeah. So what's your opinion on that? Because this ties into this, doesn't it? In this creating your anticipations of circumstances, actually create your world, which supports your belief system in some way.
I'm not sure whether I believe in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis at all, but it's interesting. And it's what, when I read it in college, got me into studying the Hopi, because I thought the language was so interesting. It made things happen that didn't happen in English. And I thought, wow, if NASA had developed in that language, they'd already be in another galaxy, because it's moving space-time in a whole different way. But that just may be a little kind of latter-day romanticism. There's a related idea that I had that is one of the oldest sort of formed ideas I had, because I can remember teaching college in the early 70s and throwing this out, just saying, look, how did all this get here? Because if you think about the planet that Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal saw, and you basically said, okay, here's the layout. And then you look at the planet today. So how do you get from that point to this point? And the argument of science is you do it that you randomly work with each piece. You pull the minerals out of the ground. You can see how it was done. It was done layer by layer, piece by piece. It picked up momentum. One person did it. It was done collectively over a long period of time. Well, that's one explanation. The other explanation, which is not, they're not exclusive of each other, because I think they're both true. And in Bottoming Out, I think it's chapter 7 where I bring back this idea, is that during the Stone Age, when obviously we know from Chevet and Lascaux, the wonderful images and stuff, what I imagine was the shamanism at that time, that they sent powerful thought forms out for the things they wanted: more food, more shelter, swifter transportation. And it's not as though we had a random planet with 92 or 100 or whatever elements, and we had to put them together and make these things. It's that those thought forms seeded, and at the same time that scientists worked on building this reality that's so complex now. I mean, when you think of all the machinery, at the same time that they were doing that, these thought forms were contributing to the civilization that was created. And so in a sense, this is a shamanic psychic projection from the Stone Age. And my thought is, what are we projecting now into some unknown future from our desires and our needs, and also our immensely urgent crisis we produced? And I often put that together with another story that seems to me, so I guess we each have these little seminal things, parables or something that we come to. I always come back to the Levi-Strauss chapter in structural anthropology called The Sorcerer and His Magic, in which he tells Franz Boas's story of Queselid, who was a Northwest Coast shaman. And as you read the story, and I went back to the original source and wrote my own account of this in that Planet Medicine book I did, and actually got an underground comic strip artist named Spain to illustrate it for me. And so in the last Planet Medicine from around 2000, there are pages of comic strip. But it's a wonderful story. Questled is sent to a missionary school where he sort of gets the goods on things. He comes back and like, this culture is a fraud, and all these shamans, medicine men, whatever, this is just scams. And he thinks what a great thing it would be to just show off and expose them all. And so he enrolls in the training, however you would do that. And of course, it proves his worst fear, his what he suspected, which is that it's all tricks. That instead of removing the disease object, they put a feather in their mouth, bite their tongue, and then pull out the bloody disease object. And this is such a wonderful moment in history. Before he has a chance to expose it, a woman identified in the Boaz narrative, the Questled narrative to Boaz as princess maid to invite. She's sick, and she sees Questled in her dream as curing her. And apparently she's been sick a while and nobody's been able to cure her. Questled, just etiquette calls. He goes, he does the bloody down, and she's better. Well, he's doomed at this point, because now he's like any doctor with a miracle cure. Everybody wants him. So he doesn't get a chance to expose it. He goes around and is remarkably successful everywhere he goes. And eventually people from other tribes come and actually have shaman contests in which he defeats them and shames them. Well, after a while, you realize, because you're told that who Boaz is interviewing is the greatest shaman of the whole Northwest Coast. And he's telling you how he got there. Wow. And he got there by thinking to expose it all as a fraud. And he says that only by practicing it over time did he realize that the reality lay on a totally different level. And I even remember my own experience when I took up tarot reading at age 16, and like got the weight book and the case book, and I memorized all the things, and I had the weight method of laying out the cards. And I used to go to my other family, and I was close to my stepmother, who, by the way, I hope is watching. She's still alive at 96.
Hopefully.
Yeah. And she used to bring her friends in from the local town for me to do readings, and they were startlingly accurate. And for a long time, it took a lot of years for me to realize that wasn't entirely the cards. That I didn't understand how they were so accurate. And 5 years later, it would come back to me. Well, this absolutely happened the way you predicted. And it's like, so I don't know. I was just reading the cards according to weight or case. And that really wasn't what I was doing any more than Questled was just biting, his tongue. And what we're doing is we're creating placeholders for a different energy to come in. For a different energy to come in and locate. And we, in a sense, are tricking ourselves. And our mutual friend, Jeff Kripal, writes about this a lot. He points out how Russell Targ, the really greatest remote viewer of our time that we know of, great enough that the Pentagon hired him to look at Soviet installations during the Cold War. He started off just trying to be a pretend magician, doing stage tricks. And reading people's minds, and he started getting accurate information. So I think that that I think I in that chapter, I forget what I call the chapter, but something about chicanery, there is a certain sense in which we trick ourselves, and in a sense, you could pull all these threads back to those shamans the Stone Age shamans trying to manifest things, not realizing that it would take tens of thousands of years and that many generations to manifest them.
Fascinating. Sarah, have you got any comments on that? It was just extraordinary.
It makes me think of, I was reading an article recently about this idea that dark matter is information and information has mass, and that I agree totally that once you start thinking about something, you basically make a choice as to the world that you see, and you are the person that you keep telling the story of over and over again, and we do tend to repeat ourselves a lot. So yeah, just really fascinating. I've got one more question from Devendra Tak. This question is there ultimately one, or do individuals have separate identities that span lifetimes, and who is in control of setting things up?
Who's in control of setting things up? Such a human question. Who's setting all this up? Who's setting me up? I don't know why this is not an answer to that question. It's just where my mind went. One of the people I admire the most is who died very recently, the poet Diane de Prima. I don't know why. It's just thinking of this. The first time I had lunch with her in the 70s in a Chinese restaurant in Berkeley, because I was going to publish her selected poems, she said she wanted a certain chair, and she said, that's so I can keep an eye on the door in case somebody comes in to shoot me or something. And I said, well, why would anyone come in to shoot you? And she said, I don't know, because she's Italian, the Italian mafia, or the enemies of Malcolm, because she had a kid with Amira Baraka and stuff. And she listed the possibilities. And then I think that since her death, I mean, she has so many great poems, but the line that keeps getting repeated is from this poem called Rant. And it, to me, is chillingly the line for this moment in history, which is, hope I get it right, and you can hear her reading this poem on YouTube too. The war that matters, is the war against the imagination. All other wars are subsumed in it. The war that matters is the war against the imagination. All other wars are subsumed in it. Meaning that, to me, and I'm sure there are many other meanings, but to me what it means is we're fighting all these proxy wars when the real war is our lack of imagination. And I know this is all like very loosely tied to what you asked. I would just say that, or what the person asked, I would just say that it's not something we get to know who's behind it. I do think that our separate identities are real, and I also think that there is a unity consciousness as proposed in Buddhism, and that it takes going into our own depth, which is something that I'm very much an amateur at, but I do have intimations of that unity, and one can feel it, and it becomes real in its own way. I remember Andrew Harvey saying he couldn't wait till, I forget which particular skeptic, whether it was Stephen Hawking or somebody, he couldn't wait till he died, and then the lights came. He said the lights came on, and so, but I don't think of it that way. I think that people actually already know, and that these are personae, and that we know the answers to all these questions, but they're locked in other personae within us, and that we there are questions that we don't ask because we're performing this reality. Like you said, it's like being an actor. We take on this role and we perform it, and we're very good at encrypting all the other realities.
Well, was it many years ago somebody came up with games people play? Was that Eric Byrne, I think? And the idea that, the word persona, it's mask. We all have these different things. And I'd just like to very quickly make the point in terms of different times in our lives. There is the Hindu concept of the linga sarya, the long body, and that we are all long bodies from the moment of our birth to our moment of our deaths. And you can slice that long body, and at different times we have different interests and stimuli, and it's almost like Minkowski's block universe. So we're all different people. I know I am. I'm different. You're different to your family. You're different. As there's Anthony Peake, the writer, then there's Tony Peake that everybody else knows that knows me as a person. They're very different, and we switch around them. Sir, are you about to make a point?
I was just going to say, I think a lot of this idea that there's an answer to something, like you were talking about before, Richard, is not really the point of it, and that the human intellect and human language is inadequate to express or comprehend the true nature of reality. So I guess in times like maybe dreaming or visionary states or meditation, you have access to that timelessness and that kind of nothingness. But I do think that searching for some answer, things kind of have to be written down that are going to fully adequately explain stuff. And that's where I think you're right about the idea of poetry and beauty and creating beautiful things. That I remember reading somewhere once, a writer had explained poetry that it wasn't the words themselves, but it's the feelings in between the words that they conjure up that is the essence of the poetic phrase. And I get that very much. And I think that when people write really beautifully, I do think Steiner writes very beautifully as well. You get a stronger sense of things because there's an element of divinity and divine inspiration that leaps from the page into you that you get a chance to feel.
Sir, and that's why you need to read Richard's new book, because really it is extraordinary. You will. I was just sitting there and I was reading it. I was going, my God, that is just such an incredible line. And I'd go back on it and I'd read it out loud. The talent of being able to do that and to do that consistently is extraordinary. And Richard, I'm just saying that as your greatest fan. I think it's just extraordinary how you do that.
Well, thank you. That's what you kind of want on a podcast, because I feel in my own way. We learn from each other, and I don't feel that. I mean, if anything, I feel not like a polymath and not all that talented. I feel as though I've not explored all sorts of things I wish I had, and I've been very narrow tracked in some ways. So I guess we're our own worst critics or something. I remember one of the people I met in a spiritual context, a guy in Hawaii, actually an English guy living in Hawaii who was a personal coach of people. He did this whole little drama that I have somewhere in my iTunes file and haven't listened to for a while. But he has this thing where you're like in the gladiatorial ring, the Roman amphitheater, and all these enemies come out to fight you. And in the audience are all the beings who surround the earth or something, who are watching what's going on earth. And he lists all the foes that you dispatch in some fashion. And then here comes the worst foe of all, he says, and this is the one that's the hardest to fight and defeat. And what it turns out to be is self-sabotage.
Yeah. It's so true, isn't it? We all, again, it's coming back to the question of the persona, that we can always put this persona forward. We're all doing it now, that we can come forward as being incredibly confident. But inside, most of the time, there's this frightened little child going, how did I get here? Yeah. Why are people asking me these questions? Because I've got no idea. I mean, because one of the things why I write is because I want to understand. It's because the world confuses the hell out of me. And I want to know why I'm here. What's the point of it? And ultimately, just understanding. But inside,
and how to make it bearable, to make it more bearable, and to get some sort of and to begin to get into its depth, to kind of match your own intimation of depth with the depth that's there.
I remember reading a few years ago, I'm a great fan of the Spanish philosopher Michael Uguimino, but one of the things, and I never know where I found this source from, and it's the idea that we human beings, we're like a group of people living on the inside of a crater, and inside the crater is a frozen lake, and there's sheer cliffs all the way around. And the more we party and the more we skate around and the more we build bonfires to enjoy ourselves, the quicker it's going to be that the ice is going to melt. And we're inevitably, at some stage or other, we're just going to drown in the water underneath the ice. And that's almost the human condition, isn't it? We know that there is something finite about everything, and it's something, that dark night of the soul, St. John of the Cross, the idea of the dark night of the soul. And we all have that, but we all have these personas that we pretend we're okay, we pretend we understand what's going on. And I would imagine particularly people who have children, you must come across as being the confident adult because you know better than they do, but inside you're just a child yourself.
I think my kid knows a lot better than I do.
Really?
I think when your kids become adults, you kind of get the ultimate grade and critique, no matter how good a job you think you did. And I think one of the things that both my kids hold against me is that I was unable to achieve that persona. I was barely out of this family, and I just, as soon as they were articulate, I was telling them, I don't know. And I can remember my daughter saying at different times, couldn't you just be a normal dad like the other dads? And probably my birthday this year was on election day. What a day, U.S. election day. But I remember at the previous year birthday when I was really in a very dark vortex, we were in LA and visiting our daughter, and after she brought out the birthday cake with the candles, she said something like, I used to wonder, why the fuck you were my father, but now I realize you're the only possible father I could have had. And I think that's...
Well, just look at the two mega talented children you have, so they're credit to you massively, aren't they? So whatever you did, you must have done something right at some stage.
Or somebody did.
Somebody did. Again, coming back to the somebody.
Having too much of a persona is quite a good thing. I wonder if people are a bit too invested in their personas these days. I remember reading an article about how women in Hollywood were having so much plastic surgery that they can't make the microfacial movements that communicate love to their children. And I think, you see a lot of people constantly fused to their mobile phones these days as well, and actually unable to make meaningful eye contact with you because they're just not used to doing it. So I wonder whether that's going to impact our kind of the evolution of our consciousness to some extent.
Well, we could start over and have a whole other show on just whether technology has improved our psychospiritual condition or made it much worse. And whatever you want to say in such a discussion, it's really clear that there's a lot of suffering that's been created just by the technologies we developed. And that we've passed on to the generations after us, as well as some really daunting eco problems, the problems of the Anthropocene that we've entered, but we've also passed on technologies that have huge side effects.
Yeah, we were talking last week, me and Anthony were talking last week about, I really think that artists and creative people have a kind of responsibility for the future of our society by creating positive, harmonious visions. And if artists and creatives are constantly creating dystopian visions of the future, we'll end up living in that future because media is so ever present in that way these days.
Right. Well, that is the fashion of the day. I think if you read the kinds of intellectual publications that I'm, like many people, led to read, the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, it's all nihilistic and cynical. And the most admired art forms are the most nihilistic and negative and dark. That's the modern sensibility.
Yeah, because it was quite interesting because our guest last week, Myron Dial, Myron is the most sensitive person I think I've ever met. He's extraordinary on so many levels, but his art is incredibly disturbing. You know, he makes Geiger look like Enid Blyton. You know, his imagery is stark and it is powerful. But in many ways, art has to be visceral, doesn't it? It has to take you out of your comfort zone to make you actually realize what it's all about. But I think Sarah has got a very valid point here. It seems that we are moving down this path of negativity, which is then creating the negativity within our society. And it's interesting times, I think, we live in. And I think your new book sounds very exciting in terms of this. I think you've given yourself
the one that I haven't finished yet.
The one you haven't finished, but you are writing like a crazed man.
I made up my mind to write a book in 3 weeks from beginning to end. And
wow, that's amazing. I should do that.
just 100 pages. It has the working title, I don't know if it'll stick, of Reading Gateway Cards, which doesn't say much. But my 5 chapter titles are: Chapter 1 is Trump. Chapter 2 is QAnon. Chapter 3 is The Left Hand of God. Chapter 4 is COVID. And Chapter 5 is Chaos Magic. And it's tying those things together that I want to make I want to give my own kind of interpretation or more divination of of this incredibly insane moment that we're in, and what the book was in my mind because when I first joined Inner Traditions, they were working on a book called The King in Orange, about Trump and the use of magic in politics. And I was asked to work with that author a bit in shaping that book. And I just had so many ideas that were directions he wasn't going to go in. And it stayed with me. And then I just, there's a kind of frustration now for me that there's so many fertile things out there, so many things that are, and they're all being kind of reduced down to, for the most part, to this kind of, to the same level. And I thought QAnon was a really good way to go with it. And I say that word aware that people hate the word. When I was doing the publishing, my first employee was actually the great writer, science fiction writer in part, Jonathan Latham. And we've been corresponding lately. When I told him that I was writing about QAnon, he said, "Ugh, I don't envy that. I can't even use the word." Well, I like the letter Q a lot, especially from its role in asking all the great questions in Latin, as Robert Graves pointed out. But I just think it's the opening into talking about, because it's like a cult. It's just crazed. It runs across whole areas like the pandemic. So, and I just see that tying in with the chaos magic stuff that was in this other book. And so I explored that.
Was that Gary Lachman, the Dark Star Rising book? He wrote a lot about.
I haven't read him, but as Tony said, I should read him because he's right in the center of all this. So I have a mental note to look him up and read him. He's also an intertraditions author, and I guess I forget what group, but a former rock star.
Blondie.
Oh, Blondie, yeah. The tide is high, right?
Yeah, he was a previous. He has been on this show twice, I think, in the past, Gary. And Gary is probably one of the most extraordinary writers I know in terms of the breadth and depth of his inquiry. From people like Blavatsky to Colin Wilson, he really is an amazing guy. Mega talented and so interesting, I think, in many ways. And Sarah, he was featured in your Explorers Club, wasn't he, recently, I think?
Yeah, we just talked to him a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, that's good. Because when you mentioned the King in Orange, I was reminded of the King in Yellow, which is, I think...
Well, that's what he named it after.
He did. One of the most disturbing stories ever written, and I thought I picked up the nuance there, and I thought, I bet he's referring to the King in Yellow. Right, moving on. We're now moving towards the end of probably, I think 2 hours is probably the limit we can go. Richard, are there any other final points you'd like to make at all, or any things you'd like to discuss as we get towards the end?
Well, I guess I'll, because I also have a responsibility to intertraditions, I will shamelessly remind people, because we haven't said the title of the book much, Bottoming Out the Universe. When I first brought it to them, before I was a member also of their team, they didn't like the title and they changed it. And I hated what they changed it to. So they said, right, I don't understand what bottoming out the universe is. Well, I think it's what scientists try and fail to do. They think they're bottoming it out. And also it has other like sort of alternative meanings. I had subtitled the book Karma, Reincarnation, and Personal Identity. Because one of the main issues I take up is that personal identity is different than consciousness. Consciousness it could be AI in a way, but personal identity is knowing that you are somebody who has an agency and a desire, and you know that you exist. And those are the kinds of issues that I've taken up. We agreed to change the subtitle to one of the subtitles I use within the book. In the book, I had "Why is there something rather than nothing?" which is, of course, the great question. And they flipped it around to "Why there is something rather than nothing," and that is one of the riddles. There's a whole chapter in which I take up what are my favorite riddles. That being one. Another being, is this whole reality somebody else's computer simulation? And I take up the riddle of, like, the transhumanist riddle of life extension. So all of that is like sort of sifted through the book. The other project that I would mention is that when I first joined Intertraditions, I gathered a lot of other writers right at the beginning of the pandemic and put together an anthology, which is just, I guess, now coming out. I haven't even seen it yet, called The Corona Transmissions. And it has a widely varied bunch of views of the virus, the pandemic. And most of it was done early, but then I got another shot at it around September before it went to the printer. And I think it has really interesting writers in it and viewpoints. So I'll call attention to that. So that would constitute any responsibility I feel to making sure that I mention the materials. What else? What else is interesting? Particular. I mean, so much is, so it's a case of what do you choose? I think it's hard to avoid the fact that we're all to some degree or another under lockdown, and that there's no there's no real end in sight, and the vaccine is it had the entire arena, because the entire world is politicized and polarized. Everything about the not everything, but many layers of interpretation around the virus, the treatments of the virus, what constitutes good behavior in terms of not getting sick, who gets sick and why they get sick. All of these things have been made subject to layers of propaganda as well as layers of science. And the pandemic has become like a Rorschach test in a way of all these different people's projections. And so the kind of materialism that we have talked about is projected onto the virus at so many levels. And then the war against materialism is projected onto the virus. And you have wildly conflicting factions. It's, in that sense, it's no different from the entire Brexit thing in England, which in some ways, for all different reasons, I mean, where did the reality of Brexit come from? And how did so many people get behind something that actually probably very few people believe in, and yet has its own reality going forward? I think that it's just worth pointing to the fact that the world is hugely politicized and polarized at the moment, at a moment when we need anything but that. What we need is to break out of that and find ourselves. And I think of I'm sort of I think about a decade older than Tony, and we grew up, but we're both old enough to have seen the transition of eras. For me, the depth of the 1950s really stays with me. It was like a Midsummer Night's Dream, and it was much like mirages, but it was really deep. And the experience of it was deep. And then the way the 60s broke into that as kind of this awakening and revelation that looked as though it was going to take you into a whole new dimension. And then it deteriorated into its own shadow. So then it went through the alchemical nigredo so fast. And that process hasn't stopped, although crystals of light are given off here and there. But where we are now, at the start of another decade, not that the decades per se mean anything, dividing time that way, but I miss the depth. I think it's too thin, it's too pat, it's too constantly recycled, and that the effect of the internet, which many of its effects are wonderful, it also has the effect of just iterating over and over again and reflecting endlessly the same stuff, bouncing it off each other. So, I mean, I actually experience that when I get discouraged, just getting away from the computer and just turning it off, that there's an immediate mood improvement that's not easily traceable exactly to the radiation coming off the machine or the light into the brain, but just reminding oneself that in interfacing with the actual world, it's like been lost, and the amount of depth that's there that you can actually feel when you allow it in, and especially in this crisis when there's so much pain that's just in the atmosphere anyway. I mean, there's so much collective pain everywhere, and just opening to it at all, it's not good. I wouldn't say in any way it's good, but when you look into it and experience it and just settle in it, I think that the depth of life and being alive and the depth of the creation is just overwhelming and so profound. And it's right there, it's right there in everything that's happening. And yet that's not the element of it that's being like made good use of. And it's so much of the world seems to have lost the creative imagination. Mm-hmm. The sort of Corbin Rumi creative imagination, that, or to go back to Diane's poem, the war that matters is the war against the imagination. All other wars are subsumed in it. And that by that, I think the war against the virus, the war between the right and the left, in country after country, the war between materialism and religiosity, plague on both their houses kind of war.
I agree with that. I don't think anyone's going to ever be on their deathbed and say, I wish I'd spent more time online. What a shame. Life is so precious.
Absolutely. And I'm reminded, that was just a wonderful speech there. It really was incredible. And I love the reference to Corbyn and the imaginal. And I think you're quite right. The idea of the imaginal realm of Rumi and Henri Corbyn is a place that we don't live in as much, because what we're doing is we're actually sitting in front of screens and fulfilling the imaginal by a screen, which effectively we're becoming more passive in doing so. And I'm reminded as well, and Sarah will remember this, last week when we interviewed Myron Dial, one of the most astounding comments he made for me from somebody of my generation was how he was able to define quite precisely that change from innocence of the 1960s into the cynicism of the 1970s with the Manson murders. And he just dropped in, didn't he, Sarah, in general conversation, that he knew the Manson family in Chatsworth. And you suddenly then feel the touch of evil almost, and the realization that it's there and it's dangerous and it's an ever-present scenario that we all have to face in one way or another. Well, all I can say is that was extraordinary. I really, really enjoyed it. And I think we are now building up a real treasure trove of programs here. And I think the time is right. It's always the kind of, you always feel that we're being drawn to create this particular series of programs because the universe wants us to. I know that sounds naive and it sounds a little bit new agey, but the time is right. We're drawing people together from around the world with these new ideas and everything else. And as we've discussed, one day we'll try and get together either an online conference, or we'll do something where we'll invite all the wonderful, wonderful people that have been drawn together in this overall magical thing that we're creating. We're creating our own egregorial reality here. And I think I'm just honored to call you guys my friends, because we're creating something great. And I think the future we can create, we will be the people that will try and change this. I genuinely believe that. And if we keep focus and we keep thinking and we keep planning, we're going to make changes. We're going to make it happen, because somebody has to. Somebody has to. Right. Richard Grossinger, thank you so much for a wonderful 2 hours. It has been absolutely extraordinary and even greater than I expected it to be. Oh. And as always, Sarah, thank you for being in the background. And thanks again to the folks who are listening in today. I know that as soon as this is uploaded onto Facebook, there'll be a lot more people watching it. And in the next few days, I'll then get it up onto, tomorrow I will get it up onto YouTube as well. So thank you very much. And
can I just say it was a real honor. I really loved it. Really wonderful conversation, really beautiful speeches, really great.
Yeah, thanks both of you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Thanks. All the best.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.